Hey, everyone. Welcome to Storytelling Time, the place where every story comes alive. If you love getting lost in thrilling tales, gripping mysteries, and epic adventures, you're in the right spot. I'm your storyteller, and here, we don't just tell stories, we bring them to life. Whether it's fantasy, mystery, horror, or even a bit of comedy, we're all about immersion. So grab a snack, get comfy, and prepare for a journey that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single chapter. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join the Storytelling Time family. Let's dive into the stories that await, starting now. The girl in the graveyard was Clara, and now she slumped against the passenger window of my beat-up Corolla, the night a raw, purple contusion pressed between us. It wasn't the soft bruise of a fading sunset, but the angry bloom of fruit left too long, the kind that attracts flies and whispers of rot. Her body, stiff and unyielding, strained against the seatbelt, a single finger twitching, then another, as if trying to claw its way free. The radio hissed a broken language of static, a counterpoint to the subtle, sickening shift of her weight in the seat. I kept my gaze fixed on the road, the asphalt a ribbon of bruised black unspooling beneath the jaundice yellow rake of my headlights. But in the periphery, I studied her. The familiar, almost identical slice of her jaw, the nose with its slight, endearing hump, a souvenir from a rogue baseball at 12, a hair's breadth off-center. Now, her skin stretched taut and slick, reflecting the dim dashboard lights like a rain-licked plastic bag. And the smell. A cloying sweetness overlaid with something sharp and metallic, like musk gone bad, laced with the phantom tang of sulfur. Every instinct screamed at me to look away, to focus on the treacherous dirt road that felt like a vein beneath my tires. But I couldn't. Even like this, with the unnatural pallor and the stillness that spoke of absolute absence, there was a ghost of the Clara I knew. A cruel echo of the beauty that had once been so vibrant. For days ago, the metallic tang of a hardware store had clung to the air as I hefted the shovel, its weight promising a grim task. For days I'd spent turning the familiar earth of my backyard into something alien, the rich loam clinging under my fingernails, the shovel biting into the soil until erratic holes scarred the garden beds like the gaping mouths of greedy beasts. By the fourth night, I could sift through soil in my sleep, my hand bound in an imaginary cast of earth. For nights I had lain staring at the pockmarked ceiling of my bedroom, each imperfection a tiny crater, wondering what it felt like to be consumed by fire. Now, the shovel in the trunk thumped a dull rhythm against the car's thin skin, a morbid heartbeat. My hands on the steering wheel were rigid with cold, despite the car's wheezing heater. My lips felt cracked and dry, each breath a small, painful rasp. The girl beside me was dead, and I was bringing her home. As the first hesitant brushstrokes of dawn painted the eastern sky a sickly salmon gray, Clara shifted again. Her left eye, milky and unfocused, slipped halfway from its socket. With a casualness that made my stomach clench, she pushed it back in with the heel of her hand, a soft, wet thunk. Then, her head lolled like a broken doll's, and a strained, gurgling sound escaped her lips. "Sorry, baby," she said, the words thick and unfamiliar. "I wasn't expecting company. I'm sure you understand." In the sliver of citrus moonlight that still clung to the horizon, Clara Bellwether smiled up at me, her gums a disturbing, shell-pale curve. Clara Bellwether died on the 31st of October and was buried a week later, the date etched on her cold gray stone a month shy of her 18th birthday. In the sterile quiet of the courtroom, the boys, their faces pale and blotchy with fear, would claim it was an accident. They hadn't known she was inside, they'd sworn, their voices cracking with what might have been genuine remorse. For better or worse, a part of me believed them. The thrill of striking out matchboxes in the dark, the constellation of empty beer cans glittering on the sidewalk, a stupid prank spiraling out of control, the wrong house, the wrong time. It didn't have to be malicious. She didn't have to be home. The coroner's report cited suffocation, the clinical word stripping the horror from my mind, leaving only the raw, visceral image of flame. A stiff, hungry palm, striking over and over. I pictured Clara crawling from the burning doorway on her hands and knees, a charred silhouette against the inferno. She was dead by the time she reached the pavement, her favorite Sunday dress, the one with the tiny blue flowers, singed up to her knees. A dress I knew well enough to trace the pattern of the fabric in my memory. The boys were left with 25 to life, a sterile sentence that felt both too harsh and utterly inadequate. The Bellwethers were left with a dead daughter, a ring of ash on the pavement like a child's chalk drawing, a permanent void in their lives. And I was left with a misplaced guilt that gnawed at me like hunger, a guilt that had become an Ouroboros, endlessly devouring itself, leaving me hollow and unable to stop. Because this wasn't the sort of thing that happened to good people. Not to Clara, with her sharp wit and the way her laughter could fill a room like sunlight. Not to me, her best friend, the quiet one who always followed her lead. But it had happened. And now she was beside me, no longer laughing, no longer leading. Just, here. And the night, that bruised and festering thing, stretched on. The water spiraled down the shower drain, a murky vortex carrying with it the chalky residue of mortuary makeup, tiny iridescent flecks that might have once been glitter, and the cloying sweetness of jasmine-scented bubbles. Thin strings of dirt, like dark veins, snaked across the porcelain. Clara's head rested on her drawn-up knees, the sharp knobs of her vertebrae pressing against her skin, a stark line of molars beneath the damp fabric of her dress. The weak electric light of the bathroom washed her skin a sickly green, revealing the delicate tracery of dark veins rooted beneath its brittle surface. She turned her face towards the lukewarm spray of the showerhead, picking absently at the powdery sediment trapped beneath her fingernails. The floor of the shower stall was a gritty mess, and for a moment, I saw a child scooping up handfuls of wet sand at the beach. A pang of something akin to tenderness, sharp and unexpected, pierced through the numbness. I cranked the hot water tap until steam billowed, the air thick and suffocating. I scrubbed furiously at the mildew blooming in the grout at the base of the shower door, my movements frantic and jerky. If I can only get everything clean, I thought, the mantra echoing in the hollow spaces of my mind, everything will be all right. Clara turned her head, her gaze obscured by the rippling glass of the shower screen. "It's not as bad as all that," she said, her voice a low, wet rasp. I don't even think I felt a thing. But the words were delivered through lips the color of spoiled plums, the sentiment failing to take root in the stagnant air. I pulled 2 threadbare towels from the bottom of the linen closet, their edges frayed like old regrets. Then, a sudden, irrational urge seized me. I walked 3 times around my block, the cool night air a temporary balm against the suffocating reality within my house. Each step was a desperate attempt to ground myself, to re-enter the world of the living. But when I returned, breathless and shivering, Clara was still there, sat on my sofa as if she had simply been waiting for me to come back, as if my living room was the most natural place in the world for a corpse to reside. There were ants in my sugar bowl. A black, teeming mass drawn to the sweetness, their tiny bodies forming intricate, unsettling patterns. I tried to remove them, carefully lifting their crystal-knotted forms on the prong of a fork, but they slipped through the gaps, their delicate legs flailing, and I was left with a mess far greater than before. A tea-brown sludge bled from crushed thoraxes, the air thick with the acrid stink of vinegar. "There's a dead girl on your sofa," a voice whispered in my head, sharp and accusatory, "but let's focus on the ants in your sugar bowl." The way they threaded through the white cysts of sugar like dark veins on a blanched leaf, like the capillaries that ran just beneath the skin of my own face. I made tea anyway, the ritual a small act of defiance against the encroaching chaos. I added too much milk, the pale liquid clouding the amber tea, and sat cross-legged on the floor in front of Clara. She stared at me with vacant eyes. I stared back, trying to find some flicker of the girl I knew in the dull, lifeless orbs. We drank in silence, and ribbons of watery milk poured clean out of the gaping hole in her chest, a gruesome parody of drinking. But she didn't stop until my own cup was empty. "You're not looking at me," she said, her voice a flat monotone, "not really." "Yes, I am." I twisted the frayed edges of the shag carpet between my fingers. "Aren't I now?" "No," she said, her head lolling slightly to the side, "you're not." I left my teacup on the floor, the saucer an accusing iris of yellow against the brown carpet, and went upstairs. I took 2 cigarettes from the stale pack squashed on my father's dusty desk, the scent of stale tobacco clinging to the air. Then, a wave of nausea washed over me, and I pressed down with my heel until the fragile cylinders crumbled, the tobacco dissipating into the tawny fibers. I changed my bed sheets twice. First, the pristine eggshell white, which felt too stark, too much like a surrender. Then, the gray ones patterned with faded peonies, the muted colors a small comfort. I made a second cup of tea, the clinking of the ceramic a fragile sound in the heavy silence of the house. When I got back to the living room, Clara was still there, a silent, unmoving presence on the sofa. I was looking at her. I was not looking at her. "Do I disgust you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I shook my head, the lie a bitter taste on my tongue. Her own head lolled again, dark hair plastered to her shoulders like wet reeds. "No more than I always did." "You need to sleep," I said, the words feeling inadequate, absurd. "Baby," she tilted her head to the other side, a faint crackle emanating from her neck, "sleeping is all I've ever done." The last time I saw Clara Bellwether alive, the air had tasted of cheap tequila and the promise of something reckless. We were crammed in the back of a stranger's dented sedan, parked on a street lined with unfamiliar houses, their windows glowing with a distant, muffled revelry. Parties weren't our natural habitat. We always felt like interlopers, 2 girls playing dress-up in clothes that didn't quite fit. Blousy thrift store dresses with sleeves that swallowed our hands like a nun's habit. Tarnished necklaces snagged from dusty bins, noosing our necks with their forgotten histories. Shoplifted lipstick, a waxy crimson Clara hid beneath her mattress, more pigment than staying power. But in the hazy, citrus peel glow of the streetlights, in the low thrum of bass vibrating through the car's worn upholstery, we had looked, for a fleeting moment, beautiful. Clara had her legs curled beneath her, sitting sideways, one hand resting lightly on my knee, the other palmed against the cool glass of the window. A half-formed melody drifted from her lips, a song I couldn't quite place, its edges blurred by the alcohol. We were too close, our shoulders brushing with every lurch of the car, but it was night, and everyone else was inside, lost in the sweaty press of bodies and the haze of cheap beer. Sometimes, we all needed to feel closer than we should be, to lose ourselves a little in the anonymity of the dark. The song dissolved on Clara's lips, swallowed by a soft, wet hiccup, the combined assault of saliva and booze. "I think I should go home now," I had said, the words slurring slightly. And she had slurred back, "Have another drink, Elle." So I did. I let her pour the viscous liquor into the flimsy mouths of red plastic cups, the kind that cracked easily under pressure. I watched her swallow, her throat bobbing. "You're so pretty," she'd said, her gaze too intense, too focused. "I think you should stop, Clara." "Just let me say that," she insisted, her fingers tightening on my arm, "just that one thing." And I had wanted to say stop fucking looking at me like that, a raw, panicked thought clawing at my throat. And I had wanted to say I want to crawl inside you and make a life for myself in the city of your mind, where everything makes sense. And I had wanted to say let's just be quiet, let's just not talk, let's just not ruin a good thing by telling the truth. Instead, I had pushed open the passenger door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stumbled out onto the vein blue skin of the sidewalk, the cool concrete a sudden shock against my bare legs. "I'm going home now," I repeated, the words clearer this time, a declaration more for myself than for her. Now, the body lay with its back to my bed, the floral sheets tangled around its limbs like thorny vines. Her hands, still and pale, worried at the fabric, the chestnut strands of her hair spilling across her throat, past the childish scribbles of ballpoint pen that marred the wooden bedposts, over the gray, slack skin of her forehead. I found myself thinking about the silken, suffocating mouth of a coffin. I was remembering the unnatural stillness of her face when I had pulled her from the rose-lined earth, the cloying scent of lilies and damp soil clinging to her clothes. The radiator hummed a low, steady drone, a counterpoint to the gentle sway of the lace curtain at my open window, stirred by the cool night air. She rolled over onto her side, her movements stiff and jerky, and slotted her hands together, the fingers interlocking like pieces of a decaying jigsaw puzzle. "You still can't even look at me," her mouth moved with a disturbing slowness, the words thick and heavy, like chewing gum. "Why am I here, Elle? What's it for?" There were pink crescent moons pressed into the bed of my palms from the bite of my own nails. She pulled her knees to her chest, a sharp crack echoing in the quiet room. She pulled her knees tighter, and a molar, yellowed and loose, tumbled from between her slack lips, landing with a soft click on the floral sheet. "You can only love me when I'm not here, Elle," she whispered, her voice a breathy sigh, "you can only love me when there's nothing left to love." I pressed my cheek to the cool, smooth spread of linen beside her, the faint scent of lavender clinging to the fabric. I listened to the steady, insistent beat of my own heart, the rhythmic thump I could feel in my fingertips, entirely singular, entirely mine. "Don't tell anyone," I said, the words a low, desperate plea. "Did you want it to die with me, Elle?" She shifted again, and the dry strands of her hair fell against the nape of my neck, a chillingly intimate touch. "Were you glad it was silenced?" "Don't tell anyone," I repeated, the words barely audible this time. She sighed, a rattling sound that seemed to come from deep within her chest, and laid herself back down, her vacant eyes finally meeting mine. Crooked nose, the left eye still threatening to slip from its socket, the subtle onset of a gray-green decay beginning to wreath her jawline. The air in the room was thick with the smell of soil and rot and the heavy, buzzing silence of a cicada-filled night. "Who could I tell?" she whispered, her cold fingers brushing against my hand. "I'm not really here." And suddenly, for a fleeting, horrifying moment, I could imagine it. My own fist splitting beer cans in two like overripe fruit. My own fingers fumbling with a matchbox in the dark. My own hand striking out, again and again. But even in that imagined reality, the house would still be on fire, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I would still be the one left alone. I took her hand, her skin cold and strangely smooth. I put my face in the crook of her neck, the cloying sweetness of her scent overwhelming me, and begged forgiveness from a ghost. The ants had staged a full-scale invasion. They marched in disciplined lines across the kitchen counter, scaling the sugar canister like determined mountaineers. Their tiny black bodies swarmed the rim of the honey jar, a sticky, shimmering mass. It was a grotesque parody of industry, this relentless pursuit of sweetness in a house steeped in decay. I found myself staring at them, a strange fascination warring with a rising tide of nausea. They were so focused, so single-minded in their task. Unlike me, adrift in a sea of guilt and the increasingly bizarre reality of my houseguest. I tried to clean again. Armed with disinfectant and a bristly brush, I attacked the kitchen surfaces, scrubbing until my knuckles ached. The smell of bleach mingled with the cloying sweetness emanating from the living room, a chemical warfare waged against the encroaching rot. But it felt futile, like trying to sweep back the tide with a broom. The decay wasn't just physical, it was seeping into the very air of the house, a miasma of unspoken grief and terrible secrets. Clara remained on the sofa, a silent, watchful presence. Sometimes, her head would loll to the side, her unfocused gaze settling on some unseen point in the room. Other times, her milky eyes would fix on me, and I would feel a prickle of unease, a sense of being scrutinized by something no longer truly there. One afternoon, I found her humming. It was a faint, tuneless drone, a vibration that seemed to emanate from deep within her chest. The sound was unsettling, devoid of the melody I remembered, the off-key enthusiasm she used to bring to every song on the radio. This was just a raw, mechanical hum, like a broken machine struggling to function. I tried to ignore it, busying myself with mundane tasks. Folding laundry, though Clara's singed dress lay untouched in the hamper. Dusting shelves already coated in a fine layer of something I didn't want to examine too closely. Preparing meals I had no appetite for, the aroma of simmering vegetables feeling alien and wrong in the current atmosphere of the house. As dusk bled through the windows, painting the living room in shades of bruised purple and stagnant gray, Clara spoke. Her voice was weaker now, a dry rustle like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. "Do you remember that time at the lake?" The question startled me. It was so specific, so rooted in a memory of our shared past. A memory that felt impossibly distant now, separated by a chasm of death and my own increasingly desperate actions. "The summer after freshman year?" I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "We tried to build that raft," she continued, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, "with those stupid logs we found by the shore." A faint smile touched my lips, unbidden. I remembered the splintered wood, the tangled rope, our clumsy attempts at knots that kept coming undone. We had spent the entire afternoon in the sweltering heat, laughing and arguing, our teenage frustration eventually giving way to exhausted camaraderie as the makeshift raft stubbornly refused to float. "It just kept tipping over," I said, a genuine flicker of warmth in the coldness that had settled around my heart. "And then that water snake swam right past your foot," Clara said, a faint echo of her old amusement in her voice. "You screamed like a banshee." I chuckled, a small, choked sound. I had screamed. Clara had laughed until tears streamed down her face, her bright, infectious laughter echoing across the still water. A long silence stretched between us, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The shared memory hung in the air, a fragile bridge across the chasm that now separated us. Then, Clara's voice shifted, the lightness gone, replaced by the same flat, unsettling tone. "Why are you doing this, Elle?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. I avoided her gaze, my eyes fixed on the swirling patterns of the worn carpet. "You know why," I mumbled, the words a weak defense against the truth. "Do I?" Her voice was laced with a weary resignation. "Or are you just pretending I do?" The silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. The ants continued their relentless march across the kitchen counter. The grandfather clock ticked on, each second a stark reminder of the time that was passing, the time I was wasting in this macabre charade. And in the fading light, the ghost of a shared laughter felt like the cruelest torment of all. Sleep offered little respite, just a shifting landscape of shadows and the persistent, low hum that now seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. I'd wake with a jolt, heart hammering against my ribs, the lingering scent of dust and something vaguely metallic clinging to the back of my throat. The first sliver of dawn filtering through my curtains would bring a fresh wave of dread, the stark reality of Clara waiting downstairs. One morning, I found her sitting upright on the sofa, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. One of her arms lay across her chest, the fingers curled into a loose fist, while the other dangled limply at her side. Her mouth was slightly agape, revealing the gap where her molar had fallen out. She looked like a discarded mannequin, posed carelessly and forgotten. A wave of panic washed over me. Had she changed? Was the subtle decay accelerating? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a primal fear of the unknown creeping into my carefully constructed denial. I busied myself with a frantic cleaning spree, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless, rearranging objects that were perfectly aligned. It was a desperate attempt to exert some control over a situation that was spiraling further and further out of my grasp. Later that day, I found myself drawn to the photographs scattered on the mantelpiece. Pictures of Clara and me, frozen in moments of laughter and youthful exuberance. Clara with her bright, mischievous eyes and that gap-toothed grin. Clara with her arms slung around my shoulder, pulling me into a hug that always felt a little too tight, a little too possessive. There was one photo in particular that caught my eye. It was taken the summer we turned 16, at the local carnival. We were standing in front of a garishly painted backdrop of a pirate ship, our faces flushed with the thrill of the tilt-a-whirl and too much cotton candy. Clara was beaming, her hair windblown and tangled, a smear of blue raspberry on her cheek. I was smiling awkwardly, self-conscious of my braces, but Clara's sheer joy had been infectious, pulling me into the moment. Looking at that picture now, the vibrant life in her eyes was a stark contrast to the dull, vacant stare she now possessed. It felt like looking at a ghost, a cruel reminder of everything that had been stolen. Driven by a sudden impulse, I picked up the photograph and went into the living room. I knelt down in front of the sofa, holding the picture out to Clara. "Remember this?" I asked, my voice thick with unshed tears. "The pirate ship?" Her head remained tilted at that strange angle, her eyes unfocused. There was no flicker of recognition, no spark of memory. Just the same vacant stare. A wave of despair crashed over me. It was like trying to communicate with a stone, a beautiful, familiar stone that had somehow lost its essence. "Clara?" I whispered, reaching out and gently touching her cold hand. It felt like holding a piece of marble, smooth and lifeless. Her fingers twitched slightly. My breath caught in my throat. Her voice was barely audible, a dry, papery rustle. My heart leaped. "Clara? Can you hear me?" Her eyes slowly, laboriously, turned towards me. There was a flicker in their depths, a fleeting spark that might have been recognition. "It hurts," she whispered, her brow furrowing slightly. "What hurts?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Tell me." "Everything," she said, the single word heavy with a profound, incomprehensible suffering. Then, her eyes glazed over again, the flicker extinguished, and she was gone once more, lost in the silent, decaying world she now inhabited. The single word hung in the air between us, a stark reminder of the brutal reality I was trying so desperately to ignore. It hurt. Of course it hurt. The fire, the suffocation, the slow, inexorable process of death. And now, this unnatural, agonizing half-life. The photograph slipped from my numb fingers and fluttered to the floor, the image of a vibrant, laughing Clara staring up at me with accusing eyes. The weight of what I was doing, the sheer impossibility and the inherent cruelty of it, pressed down on me, suffocating me more effectively than any fire. That night, sleep was even more elusive. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window, sounded like Clara shifting in the living room below. The low hum that permeated the air felt amplified in the darkness, a constant, unsettling vibration. When the first pale light of dawn finally seeped through my curtains, I didn't hesitate. I went straight to the spare bedroom, the one I rarely used, and began to rummage through the boxes stacked in the corner. They held relics of our shared past, faded yearbooks, dog-eared paperbacks, a collection of mixed CDs with handwritten labels. I was searching for something specific, something I hadn't thought about in years. Finally, buried beneath a pile of old band T-shirts, I found it. A small, leather-bound journal with a clasp shaped like a silver crescent moon. It was Clara's. She had given it to me one rainy afternoon when we were 13, declaring it our book of secrets. We had filled the first few pages with childish confessions and elaborate plans for the future, but eventually, like most childhood pacts, it had been forgotten, tucked away in the detritus of our evolving lives. My hands trembled as I opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded in places. Clara's familiar, looping handwriting filled the early entries, interspersed with my own more angular scrawl. As I flipped through the pages, snippets of our younger selves sprang to life: crushes, school gossip, anxieties about fitting in. Then, the entries shifted. The tone became more introspective, more focused on Clara's inner world. There were poems, some beautiful and haunting, others filled with a restless energy I hadn't fully understood at the time. There were sketches, mostly of faces, some recognizable as people we knew, others ethereal and unknown. And then, I found it. A series of entries from the months leading up to her death. The handwriting was different here, more frantic, the letters jagged and uneven. The words spoke of a growing unease, a sense of being watched, of shadows at the edges of her vision. There were cryptic phrases, half-formed thoughts that hinted at a fear she hadn't shared with me. The air feels thick, like something is waiting. Every creak of the house at night, it's not just the old wood. I saw a face at the window. Just for a second. But it was there. My blood ran cold. These weren't the anxieties of a typical teenager. There was a genuine fear in these words, a sense of something sinister lurking just out of sight. Had she tried to tell me? Had I been too caught up in my own world to notice? The guilt, a familiar and unwelcome companion, twisted in my gut. The last entry was dated just a few days before the fire. It was short, barely a few lines, scrawled in what looked like near darkness. It's getting closer. I can feel it. L.I. The sentence ended abruptly, unfinished. A chilling premonition hanging in the silence of the aged paper. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. Clara's fear, captured in these faded words, felt more real, more tangible than her silent presence downstairs. Had the fire really been just a tragic accident? Had there been something else, something darker at play? A sudden thought struck me, sharp and insistent. The boys had said they didn't know she was inside. But had someone else known? Had Clara been targeted? The weight of my actions, the act of bringing her back, suddenly felt different. It wasn't just about my grief anymore. It felt like I had stumbled into something far more complex, something potentially dangerous. And Clara, in her strange half-life, might somehow be connected to the answers hidden within the frantic entries of her secret book. I clutched the journal to my chest, the worn leather cool against my skin. The low hum from downstairs seemed to intensify, a subtle vibration that resonated deep within my bones. I had brought Clara home, but now I had a terrifying new question: what had I truly brought back with her? The journal felt heavy in my hands, a tangible link to the vibrant, living Clara and the terrified girl who penned those final, frantic entries. I needed to see her again, to look beyond the pallor and the stillness, to search for any flicker of the fear that had haunted her last days. Downstairs, the living room was bathed in the muted light of late morning. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams slanting through the grimy window. Clara sat in the same position as before, her head lolling slightly, her gaze fixed on some unseen point. But this time, I didn't feel the same wave of despair. The journal had given me a new lens through which to view her, a sense that there was more to her current state than just the absence of life. I sat on the floor in front of her, the worn carpet scratching against my knees. I opened the journal again, carefully turning to the last entry. I whispered the unfinished sentence aloud, the sound swallowed by the silence of the room. There was no response, no flicker of recognition in her vacant eyes. But I persisted. I began to read aloud the earlier entries, the light-hearted anecdotes of our childhood, the clumsy teenage poems, the hesitant explorations of first crushes. As I spoke, my voice wavered, catching on memories that now felt bittersweet and impossibly distant. Still, Clara remained unresponsive. The only sound was the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a steady march of time, a stark contrast to the frozen state of the girl before me. Frustration began to bubble within me. Was this all for nothing? Was she truly just a shell, incapable of any connection to the past? Then, as I read a particularly silly entry about a disastrous attempt to bake a cake for her birthday, I saw it. A subtle twitch at the corner of her lips. It was barely perceptible, a fleeting muscle spasm that might have been my imagination. I held my breath and read the next entry, a teenage lament about a boy who hadn't called. Again, the faintest twitch. Hope, fragile but insistent, began to bloom in my chest. Could she still be in there, trapped beneath the surface? Could these memories somehow be reaching her? I continued reading, my voice gaining strength. I recounted our disastrous attempt to sneak into a movie, the time we got lost in the woods and had to be rescued by a grumpy park ranger, the countless nights we spent huddled together, sharing secrets and dreams under a blanket fort. As I spoke, the subtle twitches became more frequent. Her eyelids fluttered slightly. Her fingers, resting on the arm of the sofa, seemed to flex almost imperceptibly. Then, a sound. A low, guttural murmur escaped her lips. It wasn't a word, not yet, but it was a sound. A sign of something stirring within the stillness. I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Clara?" I whispered. "Can you hear me?" Her head lolled slightly, and her unfocused gaze seemed to drift in my direction. The air in the room felt charged, expectant. "The lake," she rasped, the word barely audible, thick with disuse. "The lake." The disastrous raft, the screaming at the water snake, her bright, echoing laughter. A specific memory, pulled from the depths of our shared past. Tears welled in my eyes. "Yes, Clara. I remember the lake." Another long silence stretched between us, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Then, her lips moved again, forming another word, slurred and indistinct. "Afraid. Afraid." The word echoed the fear in her journal, the sense of something lurking. Was she reliving those final, terrifying moments? "What were you afraid of, Clara?" I asked softly, reaching out to gently stroke her cold hand. Her fingers tightened around mine, a weak but definite grip. It was the first real connection I had felt since I brought her back. "The shadows," she whispered, her voice fading again. "They watched." Shadows. Watching. The cryptic phrases from her journal, now spoken in her unnatural half-life. A chilling confirmation of the fear that had consumed her. The grip on my hand loosened, her eyes glazed over once more, and she fell back into her silent stillness. But something had shifted. A fragile line of communication had been opened. The Clara I knew, or at least a fragment of her, was still in there. And the fear that had haunted her final days might hold the key to understanding what had truly happened to her. My desperate act of bringing her home had become something more than just an act of grief. It felt like the beginning of a terrifying and uncertain investigation. The breakthrough with the journal had ignited a fragile spark of purpose within the suffocating darkness of my days. Clara's fragmented words, echoing the fear in her final entries, felt like breadcrumbs, a faint trail leading through the bewildering maze I had created. I spent the next day immersed in the journal, rereading every entry, searching for more clues, more echoes of the shadows that had haunted her. I scrutinized her sketches, looking for recurring motifs, for any hint of the faces she might have seen at the window. But the drawings were mostly abstract or of people I recognized, their familiar features offering no insight into Clara's fear. The poems, however, were more unsettling. They spoke of darkness encroaching, of unseen eyes, of a feeling of being trapped. Lines like, "The walls have ears, the night has teeth," and "The shadow stretches, long and cold, a story waiting to unfold," resonated with the chilling entries from her final weeks. As I read, Clara remained on the sofa, her stillness punctuated by occasional twitches or soft murmurs. Once, she whispered the word "cold," her voice barely audible, and shivered, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun filtering through the window. The idea that she might be experiencing some lingering echo of her final moments, the terror and the physical sensations, was deeply disturbing. It fueled my resolve to understand what had happened, not just for my own fractured peace of mind, but for her. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange, I decided to try something different. I put on one of Clara's favorite mix CDs, a collection of angsty indie rock and forgotten pop anthems that had been the soundtrack to our teenage years. As the opening chords of a familiar song filled the silent house, I watched Clara intently. Her head remained still, her eyes vacant. But as the chorus swelled, a faint tapping began. Her fingers, resting on the arm of the sofa, were tapping out a rhythm, a hesitant, uneven beat that mirrored the music. My breath caught in my throat. It was a small thing, a barely conscious movement, but it was there. A connection to the music that had once been so vital to her. I skipped to another track, a fast-paced punk song that used to make us jump around and air guitar with reckless abandon. The tapping in her fingers became slightly more pronounced, a faint echo of the energy the song once evoked. It was a fragile form of communication, a language spoken through forgotten rhythms and lingering emotions. But it was a language I understood. Over the next few days, music became our strange form of dialogue. I played songs that held specific memories for us, the cheesy pop song that played during our first school dance, the melancholic ballad we listened to after our first heartbreaks, the Riot Girl anthem that made us feel invincible. With each song, there would be a flicker, a twitch, a subtle movement. A tightening of her grip when a particularly emotional lyric played, a slight tilt of her head during a familiar melody, the faint tapping of her fingers keeping time. Through these fragmented responses, a picture began to emerge. A picture of a girl who had been happy, vibrant, and full of life, but who had also been increasingly burdened by a growing fear in her final weeks. The shadows she had mentioned in her journal and whispered in her half-life seemed to be the key. But what were these shadows? Were they real, or a manifestation of a troubled mind? And how did they connect to the fire? The boy's story of a prank gone wrong still felt plausible, a senseless tragedy born of youthful recklessness. But Clara's fear, documented in her own hand, cast a long, unsettling shadow over that explanation. I knew I couldn't stay hidden in this self-imposed isolation forever. The stench of decay was growing stronger, both literally and metaphorically. I needed answers, and the only place to find them might be outside the walls of this house, in the world I had tried so desperately to shut out. The thought filled me with a cold dread, but the image of Clara's tapping fingers, a faint echo of her lost vitality, spurred me on. For her, I had to face the shadows, whatever they might be. The prospect of leaving the house felt like stepping out of a warped reality and back into a world that had continued to spin without me. The familiar streets seemed alien, the faces of passers-by distant and unreadable. The air outside lacked the cloying sweetness that had become the constant backdrop of my existence. My first destination was the Bellwether house. It stood silent and still on its manicured lawn, the windows dark and empty, like vacant eye sockets. A yellow police tape, faded and tattered by the elements, still clung to the porch railings, a ghostly reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there. A knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. What was I hoping to find here? Residual grief? Lingering anger? A clue that the fire hadn't been an accident? I walked slowly up the driveway, the crunch of gravel under my worn sneakers the only sound in the quiet afternoon. The front door was sealed with a sticker that read, "Property of Police Department, do not enter." I pressed my face against the dusty glass of the living room window, peering into the shadowed interior. The room was eerily still, frozen in time. Overturned furniture, a scorched rug, the ghostly outline of where the fire had licked the walls. It was a scene of violent disruption, a stark contrast to the peaceful facade of the house. I tried the front door, but it was locked. Disheartened, I walked around the side of the house, my gaze sweeping over the charred remains of the exterior wall where the fire had been most intense. The smell of ash still lingered in the air, a faint, acrid scent that made my stomach churn. As I rounded the back of the house, I saw it. A small patch of disturbed earth near the overgrown flower beds. It looked like someone had been digging there recently, though the rain and the passage of time had begun to soften the edges. My heart quickened. Had the police missed this? Or had someone else been here after them? I knelt down, running my fingers over the loose soil. It felt different from the surrounding earth, softer, less compacted. A small, glinting object caught my eye. I picked it up. It was a shard of glass, blackened and warped by heat, but with a distinct iridescent sheen. It didn't look like the glass from a window. A memory flickered in my mind, Clara showing me a small, antique perfume bottle she had found at a flea market. It had been made of iridescent glass, catching the light in a rainbow of colors. She had kept it on her bedside table. Could this be a piece of that bottle? What would it be doing buried in the garden? A wave of unease washed over me. This felt wrong, out of place. The boys' prank had been about fire, about destruction. Why would they be burying something? I carefully wrapped the shard of glass in a tissue I found in my pocket and tucked it away. I needed to find out more about the investigation, about what the police had found, about what they might have missed. My next stop was the police station. The sterile environment and the indifferent faces of the officers behind the counter felt jarring after the suffocating intimacy of my house. I felt like an intruder, a ghost from a forgotten tragedy. I asked to speak to someone involved in the Bellwether case. After a long wait, I was directed to a detective named Miller, a man with tired eyes and a weary demeanor. I told him who I was, Clara's best friend. I asked about the investigation, about what they had concluded. He reiterated the official story, a tragic accident, a prank gone wrong. The boys had confessed, their remorse seemingly genuine. But I pressed him, asking about any other possibilities, about anything they might have overlooked. I didn't mention Clara's journal, not yet. I just spoke of a feeling, a persistent unease that wouldn't let me rest. Detective Miller listened patiently, his gaze unwavering. But his answers remained the same. There was no evidence of foul play, no reason to suspect anything other than a terrible accident. As I left the station, the weight of his dismissal settled heavily on my shoulders. If the police weren't looking for anything more, then I was on my own. And the small shard of iridescent glass in my pocket felt like the only tangible clue in a mystery that was growing darker and more complex with each passing day. The shadows Clara had feared might be more real, and more dangerous, than I could have ever imagined. Back in the stifling quiet of my house, the shard of iridescent glass lay on my kitchen table, catching the weak afternoon light in fleeting rainbows. It felt significant, a tangible piece of the puzzle that didn't fit the neat, tragic narrative the police had presented. Clara's perfume bottle, why would a piece of it be buried in the garden of her burned-out home? I needed to see the rest of it, to know if it was indeed the same bottle. But the Bellwether house was off-limits. A new idea, reckless but insistent, began to form in my mind. That night, under the cloak of a starless sky, I returned to the Bellwether property. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and lingering ash. The yellow police tape, barely visible in the darkness, felt like a flimsy barrier. Armed with a flashlight and a pair of gardening gloves, I made my way to the back of the house. The disturbed patch of earth was even less discernible in the dark, but I remembered the general area. I knelt down, the cold, damp soil seeping through my jeans. Working slowly and carefully, I began to dig. The soil was loose at first, but then I hit something hard. My heart pounded in my chest. It was a larger piece of glass, also blackened and warped, but unmistakably iridescent. And then another, and another. Soon, I had unearthed several fragments, enough to piece together a significant portion of what had once been a delicate, ornate bottle. The shape, the unique swirl of colors within the glass, it was definitely Clara's perfume bottle. But it was broken, shattered. And buried. A chilling realization washed over me. This wasn't something that would have happened in a simple house fire. The bottle would have likely melted or been found amongst the debris. Someone had deliberately buried these fragments. The question was, who? And why? My mind raced. Had Clara buried it herself, perhaps hiding something? But the frantic entries in her journal spoke of fear, not secrecy. Or had someone else buried it? Someone who had been at the house that night, someone who didn't want the bottle to be found. The implications were terrifying. If the fire wasn't just a tragic accident, then Clara's death might not have been either. As I carefully wrapped the glass fragments in a cloth I had brought, a sound broke the silence of the night. A twig snapping nearby. My blood ran cold. I froze, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I held my breath, listening intently. There was another sound, closer this time. A soft rustling in the overgrown bushes that lined the edge of the property. Someone was there. Fear, sharp and primal, gripped me. Had someone seen me? Were they connected to whatever had happened to Clara? I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my ears. I had to get out of here. I turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth, the precious fragments of glass clutched tightly in my hand. The sound of rustling behind me grew louder, closer. I didn't dare look back, my only thought to escape the darkness and the unseen presence that was now pursuing me through the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the relative safety of my own street, my lungs burning, my body trembling. I slipped inside my house, locking the door behind me, the sound of the bolts sliding home echoing in the sudden silence. Leaning against the door, gasping for breath, I looked down at the cloth in my hand. The iridescent fragments glowed faintly in the dim light of my hallway, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. My reckless act had yielded a crucial clue, but it had also confirmed my deepest fears. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. And now, I wasn't just haunted by the ghost of my best friend. I had the chilling feeling that I had stumbled into a darkness that was very much alive. The encounter in the bellwether garden had shaken me to my core. The feeling of being watched, pursued, was a stark reminder that my actions had consequences beyond the confines of my own grief-stricken home. I couldn't shake the image of the unseen presence, the rustling in the darkness. Back in the relative safety of my house, I laid the iridescent glass fragments on the kitchen table. They seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, each shard a silent accusation. The perfume bottle, a symbol of Clara's vibrant individuality, was now a broken relic, deliberately buried. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. Detective Miller's dismissive attitude at the police station had been disheartening, but the events of the night had changed everything. I had tangible evidence that something wasn't right. The next morning, armed with the wrapped fragments of the perfume bottle and Clara's journal, I returned to the police station. This time, my demeanor was different. The quiet grief had been replaced by a nervous urgency. I insisted on speaking to Detective Miller again. When he finally appeared, his weariness seemed to deepen at the sight of me. "Miss Vance," he began, his tone suggesting he hoped this would be a brief encounter. "I was at the Bellwether house last night," I said, my voice trembling slightly but firm. I found something. I unwrapped the glass fragments and laid them on his desk. The iridescent colors shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights of the station. This is from Clara's perfume bottle, I explained. I found it buried in the garden, near the back of the house. Detective Miller's eyebrows furrowed. He picked up one of the larger pieces, examining it closely. The fire investigators didn't find anything like this, he said, his voice thoughtful. I then produced Clara's journal, opening it to the final, frantic entries. I pointed to the lines about the shadows, the feeling of being watched. Clara was afraid, I told him. She wrote about feeling like someone was watching her in the weeks before the fire. She was scared, Detective. This wasn't just a random accident. Detective Miller read the entries, his expression becoming increasingly serious. He asked me detailed questions about where I found the glass, about Clara's state of mind in the weeks leading up to her death, about anything she might have told me. I recounted the strange tapping, the whispered words, the fleeting moments of connection. I told him about the unseen presence in the garden the night before. He listened intently, his initial weariness replaced by a focused intensity. When I had finished, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the iridescent shards on his desk. "Miss Vance," he said slowly, "this changes things." He promised to reopen the investigation, to look into the possibility that the fire wasn't an accident. He took the glass fragments and the journal as evidence. Leaving the police station, a sliver of hope pierced through the darkness that had enveloped me. Finally, someone was listening. Finally, there was a chance that the truth about Clara might be uncovered. But the encounter in the garden still haunted me. Someone knew I was snooping around. Someone was watching. And as I returned to my silent house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stirred something dangerous, something that wouldn't remain hidden for long. Clara's ghost wasn't the only presence in my life anymore.